July 15, 2024. 5:47 a.m. The intersection of Maple and 4th, a quiet suburban corner lined with shady trees. Elizabeth Harper, 43, was behind the wheel of her silver Honda Civic, the radio humming Sweet Home Alabama at low volume. The sunrise painted the treetops gold, and she glanced at her watch, cursing under her breath. She might be late for her 6 a.m. shift at St. Michael's Hospital. A veteran ICU nurse of over 2 decades, she was no stranger to the rush, the sleepless nights, the endless shifts. But this morning something felt off. A strange hum in the air she couldn't name. She didn't see it coming. A black pickup truck, a roaring beast on oversized tires, barreled through the red light at 65 miles an hour. The driver, a middle-aged man with eyes shut from exhaustion, turned her peaceful morning into a nightmare. The crash was like a bomb, metal screamed, glass exploded into a jagged rain, and her Honda spun like a discarded toy. Her head slammed against the driver's side window, a white-hot pain erupting through her ribs. Blood filled her mouth, its metallic tang choking her. Time slowed. She heard sirens in the distance, faint as a dream. The airbag punched her face, her chest crushed under invisible weight. Then, like a switch flipped off, darkness swallowed her. But it didn't last. She was floating, not in the car but above it. Below, her Honda was a mangled wreck, her body limp, blood staining her white scrubs. A paramedic with a ponytail shouted, "No pulse. Start compressions." Elizabeth wanted to scream, to say she was still here, but no sound came. The pain was gone, replaced by an eerie detachment, like she was watching a horror movie starring herself. Her heart stopped for the first time in the ambulance, amid blaring sirens and the defibrillator's sharp beep-beep. They brought her back, but it was only the beginning of the nightmare. The operating room at St. Michael's was chaos unleashed. Surgeons in green scrubs moved like dancers in a deadly ballet. Ruptured spleen, punctured lung, internal bleeding. "Get blood now." The lead surgeon's yells cut through the clamor of machines. Elizabeth lay on the table, tubes and wires snaking across her blood-soaked body. She'd lost nearly 2 liters of blood. Her injuries a grim list. Broken ribs, fractured femur, cracked pelvis, a gaping tear in her abdomen. But she wasn't there, not really. When her heart stopped the second time, for 7 minutes and 23 seconds, an unseen force pulled her. It wasn't falling or rising. It was stepping through a door that didn't exist. One moment, she heard the scalpel slicing her flesh. The next, she stood in a boundless space flooded with light. Not the harsh glare of her lamps, but a living light, warm, alive, wrapping her in peace. For the first time that day, fear melted away. Then she saw them, giant wheels of light hovering in the void. They defied anything she'd ever known. Towering dozens of feet, spinning within themselves, wheels within wheels, like some cosmic machine gone wild. Thousands of eyes, not human but glowing blue-white gems, covered them, watching her, knowing her, piercing every secret of her soul. They moved without obeying physics, sliding sideways, spinning vertically, forward and back at once, never turning. Their sound was a rush of ocean wind mixed with a choir from beyond Earth. Elizabeth stood there, no longer a nurse, no longer a crash victim. She was a stranger in a realm beyond imagination, and deep down she knew she was dead. The light shifted. From the giant wheels, later she'd learned they were called ophanim. A radiant corridor formed, as if the universe parted for something greater. The sound deepened, a blend of roaring water and haunting, wordless music. Then they appeared, the cherubim. Elizabeth nearly collapsed at their beauty. Each stood taller than a building, with 4 faces, human, lion, ox, eagle, shifting on a single body, embodying every living essence. Their 6 massive wings vibrated, rippling the air, bending reality itself. She had no time to marvel. The corridor widened, and at its end she saw him. A man, but more than a man. He sat on a throne of living sapphire, shimmering like it held a galaxy. His hair was white as snow, his face youthful, his eyes brimming with love and wisdom she'd never known. He smiled, and though no sound came from his lips, a voice echoed in her soul. "Elizabeth, my child, fear not. I've brought you here to see what few have seen." She wanted to kneel, to weep, but her body, or whatever she was now, wouldn't obey. He stood, and the space trembled. The ophanim spun faster, the cherubim bowed, covering their faces with wings, and he waved his hand, pulling her into a journey she'd never forget. Before her, a world unfolded. Not Earth, but a realm where angels moved in perfect harmony. He pointed to the Ophanim. They are my presence everywhere, always at work. Then the cherubim. They keep the rhythm of creation, humanity, nature, and beyond. He turned to her, eyes blazing. Look, he said, and she saw herself, or rather her crash, from another angle. Angels stood around her wrecked car, hands softening the impact. In the oar, they guided surgeons' hands, fending off dark shadows clawing at her. Elizabeth trembled. Am I really dead? She asked. He smiled sadly. Not quite. But you've crossed the line. The journey stretched on, and Elizabeth felt like she was gliding through endless skies. Jesus, for she was certain it was him, showed her sights that stole her breath. Millions, no billions of angels, a vast empire with no end. Seraphim blazed like living fire, circling a blinding core she couldn't face. Smaller angels, more familiar, with white wings and sharp eyes, walked beside humans, in hospitals, schools, even on the highway where she'd crashed. He paused, pointing to a group bending over tiny beams of light rising from Earth. Prayers, he explained. Each one's a spark, and the angels bring them to me. She saw Ophanim spinning, orchestrating the sparks into intricate chains of events. A mother's plea in a hospital waiting room led to a doctor saving a child. A desperate whisper from a truck driver, ironically perhaps the one who hit her, kept him alive to face his guilt. They're not just messengers, he said, voice warm. They're the backbone of creation, keeping it all in motion under my will. She saw battles. Angels with blazing swords clashing with snarling shadows she couldn't name. One fight raged in her oar, as angels repelled darkness trying to claim her soul. They're always there, he said. Humans just forgot how to see. Elizabeth felt small but not insignificant. Why me? She asked. He looked at her, and in that moment, she felt he saw every pain, every joy, every scar of her life. Because you'll tell it, he replied. And because this time needs you. Her talk with Jesus didn't last long, or so it seemed. Time here wasn't like Earth's. He showed her human history. Abraham under a starry sky, Moses facing an angel in the desert, Ezekiel collapsing by the Chebar River as Ophanim appeared. They've always been there, he said. And they're still here, even when people deny them. She saw angels in modern moments. A soldier surviving Iraq by a gut feeling. A child pulled from floodwaters by an unseen hand. Then he touched her forehead. A searing light flooded her mind, like 1,000 books downloaded at once. Knowledge of angels, the universe, the wheels of light, and unseen battles. It overwhelmed human words. You must return, he said. They need to know they're not alone. She wanted to stay to ask more but had no chance to argue. The Ophanim spun faster, forming a tunnel of radiant light. The cherubim raised their wings, their song a farewell chorus. She felt pulled, riding an invisible wave. The light faded, and she heard the beep-beep of an ICU monitor. Opening her eyes, she saw a white ceiling, a breathing tube in her nose, and a young nurse shouting, "She's awake!" 3 days had passed since the crash. Doctors called her a miracle, surviving such injuries, no brain damage despite minutes without oxygen. But Elizabeth knew the truth. She'd crossed death, seen the wheels of light, and now carried a mission she wasn't ready to face. Elizabeth woke in the ICU, but she didn't feel back. Her head throbbed, as if someone had stuffed a library into her skull. The monitor beeped steadily. Nurses whispered beyond the curtain. Antiseptic stung her nose. It all felt wrong, too mundane after what she'd seen. She looked at her trembling hands, for lines snaking across them. This was her body, but it wasn't hers anymore. Maria, the head nurse, a warm Latina with a bright smile, checked her chart. God, Liz, you scared us to death. 3 days out, heart stopped twice, and you're still here. You're a fighter. Elizabeth managed a weak smile, but in her mind, the wheels of light still turned, blue-white eyes watching from another realm. I'm not sure I was here the whole time, she whispered, voice raspy through the tube. Maria frowned but didn't press. Doctors came later, a white-coated team with awe and skepticism in their eyes. They rattled off her injuries like a menu. Spleen removed, lung patched, for broken ribs, femur pinned with titanium. You shouldn't be alive, Dr. Patel, the lead surgeon, said bluntly. 7 minutes without oxygen? Brain damage sets in after 3. You're a rare case. Elizabeth nodded, but she knew it wasn't medicine. It was the unseen hands that pulled her back. That night, as the ICU hushed, she stared out the window. Moonlight streamed through, and for a moment she saw it. A faint pattern, wheels within wheels, hovering in the reflection. She blinked and it vanished. But the feeling lingered. A presence, a reminder she wasn't alone. Jesus had told her to tell, but tell what? How could she explain what defied words, defied her own reason? She closed her eyes, and the cherubim's song lulled her into a restless sleep. 2 weeks later, Elizabeth left St. Michael's. She rolled out in a wheelchair, body weak but mind a mess. Her sister Sarah, a no-nonsense elementary teacher with blonde hair, drove her to her small apartment. You freaked me out, Liz, Sarah said, gripping the wheel. Mom cried for 3 days straight. Don't do that again, okay? Elizabeth chuckled, but her gaze drifted. She saw faint shapes by the roadside, not as clear as in the light, but enough to know they were there. Angels. Always there. Her apartment was unchanged. A worn gray sofa, shelves of medical novels and an old Bible, a faint coffee scent from a machine she'd left on before the fateful shift. But everything felt alien. In the bathroom mirror, she saw not just her face, dark circles, a faint scar on her forehead, but a flicker of light like an Ophanim shadow. She flinched, nearly dropping the hand mirror. Am I losing it? She wondered, but deep down, she knew it wasn't a hallucination. That night she dreamed, or something more vivid. She stood in the OR but as an observer. Angels surrounded her lifeless body, hands glowing as they guided the surgeons. A massive black shadow reached for her, but Ophanim appeared, wheels spinning fiercely, driving it back. Jesus's voice echoed, You must tell them. The time is coming. She woke, drenched in sweat, heart pounding. It was 3 a.m. and sleep wouldn't return. Elizabeth started writing. Her hand shook as she held the pen, but she wrote, The wheels of light, cherubim with 4 faces, Jesus on the sapphire throne. She described the overwhelming love, how angels orchestrated prayers like a cosmic symphony. But rereading it, she stopped. Who'd believe this? She thought. Sarah would say it's brain trauma. Colleagues would laugh. The hospital would send her to a shrink. Yet the call in her heart rang loud, as powerful as the cherubim's song. Elizabeth returned to St. Michael's after 6 weeks, not as a nurse but for a checkup. She limped with a cane, her femur aching in the cold. Colleagues greeted her with hugs and cheers, but she felt distant. They talked shifts, patients, daily grind, while her head buzzed with Ophanim and Jesus's voice. She wanted to shout, Don't you see? There's a whole other world right here. But she stayed quiet, a forced smile hiding her storm. In the waiting room she met Jake, the paramedic who'd saved her. Tall, brown hair a mess, eyes sharp, he handed her coffee from a vending machine. You're the toughest survivor I've ever seen, he said. No pulse, no breathing, yet here you are. I don't buy miracles, but you're making me reconsider. Elizabeth looked at him, and for a split second, she saw a faint figure behind him, an angel light shimmering around his shoulders. She took a breath. Something kept me alive you didn't see. Jake raised an eyebrow but didn't push. He recounted the crash from his view. The truck's impact, shattering glass, 10 minutes of chest compressions in the ambulance. I thought you were gone, he said. But something weird happened. It felt like someone was helping me, guiding my hands. Elizabeth shivered. She wanted to tell him about the angels, but the words stuck. Thanks, she said instead, vowing silently. I'll start somewhere. That night she opened her Bible, untouched for years. She found Ezekiel reading of wheels and cherubim. The ancient words matched what she'd seen, but 1,000 times more alive. She added to her notebook, sketching clumsy Ophanim, circles within circles, glowing eyes. She wasn't an artist, but she needed it real. Then she decided. She'd tell, even if just to one person. Jake would be first. Elizabeth met Jake at a cozy cafe near the hospital, where waffle and coffee scents mingled. She arrived early, clutching a latte she didn't sip. When Jake walked in, leather jacket and easy grin, her heart raced. Not from attraction but fear. How could she say this without sounding insane? They chatted about work, crazy calls they'd handled. Then she took a deep breath, sliding her notebook across the table. Jake, I need to tell you something. About the crash. Promise you won't laugh. He nodded, curious. She started slowly about the light Ophanim Jesus angels in the ore. She told how they saved her, how they ran everything from the other side. Her voice shook, but she didn't stop. Jake listened, twirling his coffee cup, eyes shifting from intrigue to doubt, then something unreadable. When she finished, he was silent too long. Liz, you know I'm not into this stuff, right? He said. But I don't think you're lying. I felt something in that ambulance. Like I wasn't alone. He tapped the table. What are you gonna do with this? I don't know, she admitted. Jesus told me to tell it. But I'm scared no one will believe. Jake looked at her. I'm not sure I buy it all, but I believe you. If you want to talk, I'll listen. It was enough for now. One listener. She smiled, feeling lighter for the first time in weeks. But she knew this was just the start. The world wouldn't be as kind as Jake. Word of Elizabeth's miracle survival spread through the hospital. Colleagues treated her differently. Some with awe, others with smirks. Sarah called daily, worried she had PTSD. You need a shrink, Liz, Sarah said over the phone. You almost died. Your brain's messing with you. Elizabeth snapped back. It's not in my head, Sarah. I saw it. The call ended with an angry hang-up. At the hospital, she noticed angels weren't just memories. Walking the halls during a checkup, she saw faint shapes around patients, light around an old woman near death, an angel by a kid in recovery. Not as vivid as in the light, but there like glimmers in her vision. Once she saw wheel patterns in flickering fluorescent lights, freezing mid-hall until a nurse asked if she was okay. She tried telling Rachel, a bubbly nurse she'd worked with for years. But Rachel laughed. Liz, you need a break. Angels with wheels? Sounds like sci-fi. Elizabeth flushed, retreating. She hid her notebook, writing only at night when no one saw. But the pressure grew. Dreams returned, vivid. Ophanim spinning, Jesus repeating. The time is coming. She didn't know what time, but it scared her. One evening she stared into the mirror, into her own eyes. Who am I now? She asked. A nurse? A lunatic? A chosen one? She had no answer, but she couldn't go back to her old life. The cracks in her soul had begun, and they'd only widen. Elizabeth never meant for her story to escape her tiny circle. But fate, or maybe the wheels of light, had other plans. One Saturday afternoon, as she sat with a cold tea in her living room, the doorbell rang. A woman in her 30s, gray suit, hair in a tight bun, stood there with a microphone, a cameraman behind her. Elizabeth Harper? She asked, voice crisp. I'm Jenna Price from WKLN Local News. We heard you're the miracle survivor from Maple and 4th. Can you share your story? Elizabeth froze. She wanted to slam the door, but Jenna's curious gaze held her. Who told you? She asked, voice trembling. Jenna smiled. A paramedic named Jake mentioned it to colleagues, and word got to us. You're a hot topic at St. Michael's. Elizabeth cursed Jake silently, though she knew he meant no harm. She agreed, not for fame but because Jesus's voice echoed. You must tell them. The interview happened in her living room. Jenna asked about the crash, the medical miracle, and Elizabeth answered cautiously. But when Jenna pressed, what got you through? She couldn't hold back. She spoke of the light, Ophanim, Jesus, angels in the ore. The cameraman raised an eyebrow, Jenna scribbled fast, and when it ended she said, This'll be big, Elizabeth. Thank you. Elizabeth nodded, dread swirling inside. The segment aired that night. Headline: Nurse survives crash, claims near-death vision. Sarah called instantly, furious. Liz, are you nuts? Why'd you go on TV with that? Colleagues texted, some supportive, some mocking. By morning, dozens of emails and calls flooded in from strangers. Curious folks, zealots, skeptics calling her a fraud. The spotlight had found her, and there was no hiding. Elizabeth's story spread like wildfire. Within a week, it hit online articles, local to national. Some dubbed her the woman who saw heaven. Others mocked her as the crazy Will nurse. Letters poured in. An Ohio mom thanked her for giving her son hope. A Texas pastor invited her to preach. Skeptics called her deranged or fame-hungry. At St. Michael's, tension brewed. The board called her into a closed meeting. Richard Hayes, the stern medical director, peered over thick glasses. Elizabeth, you're a good nurse, but this is hurting our reputation. We don't want a superstition label. She tried explaining. I'm not making it up. I saw it. Hayes shook his head. Take some leave. Think about what you want. Not fired, but a clear warning. Jake visited that night, pizza in hand, guilt on his face. I didn't mean for this to blow up, he said, slumping on her sofa. I only told a few people. Elizabeth sighed. It's okay, Jake. Maybe it's meant to be. She told him about the pressure, the intensifying dreams, Ophanim spinning faster, urging her on. Jake nodded. I don't get it all, but you're different. If you need backup, I'm here. Not everyone stood by her. Sarah showed up with Dr. Linda Carter, a shrink. I'm worried, Liz, Sarah said, eyes red. You need help. Dr. Carter probed gently, but Elizabeth saw it as an evaluation. She clammed up and Sarah left in tears. The line between belief and doubt sharpened, and Elizabeth felt her loved ones slipping away. Amid the chaos, Elizabeth found a lifeline. An email from Emily Tran, a freelance journalist in Chicago who wrote about spiritual experiences. I believe you. I've interviewed dozens with near-death stories and yours fits. Can we meet? They met at a park near her home, birdsong drowning out city noise. Emily, petite with bright eyes, brought a stack of notes. She pointed to accounts. People seeing light, angels, even wheels of light like Ophanim. You're not alone, she said. But you're unique. Your details, Ophanim, cherubim, how angels orchestrate events, are rare. Elizabeth felt relief. For once, she didn't have to start from scratch. Emily introduced her to a small group, near-death survivors who met monthly on Zoom. At her first meeting, Elizabeth shared her story. Tom, a plane crash survivor, nodded. I saw glowing figures in the smoke. Thought I was nuts, but I believe you. Carla, who flatlined during childbirth, said, I heard singing like your cherubim. They didn't mock or doubt, they understood. The group became her sanctuary. They urged her to write a book, flesh out her experience. Emily offered to edit. You've got a mission, she said. Not everyone will believe, but those who need it will find you. Elizabeth agreed, though scared. She wrote nightly, pages brimming with vivid images from the light. Each word pulled her deeper into a path with no return. Not everyone welcomed her story. One evening, as she wrote in her living room, a brick smashed through her window, glass shattering across the floor with a note. Stop lying. She screamed, heart racing, and called the police. Officer Daniels took the report but shrugged. Hard to trace. Could be a drunk or someone mad about your TV stuff. It wasn't random. Threatening letters followed. Anonymous emails calling her a religious nut. Handwritten notes in red ink with venomous words. One night, she saw a figure outside her house, staring before vanishing into the dark. She installed security cameras, but fear lingered. In dreams, the or shadow grew, and Ophanim spun harder to repel it. They don't want you to speak, Jesus whispered. But you must. Jake and Emily became her anchors. Jake slept on her sofa some nights, baseball bat in hand. Emily dug into the threats, linking them to Truth Guardians, a militant skeptic group online. They might be behind this, she said. Elizabeth trembled but didn't stop. She finished her book's first draft, Wheels of Light, and sent it to Emily. Darkness could push, but her light burned brighter. Elizabeth began seeing angels not just in dreams. One day, walking in the park, she saw a boy fall from his bike, head hitting pavement. She ran over, checked his pulse, nothing. Without thinking, she started CPR, called 911, and felt a faint presence guide her hands. The boy coughed, breathing again, and paramedics said, You saved him. She knew she hadn't done it alone. It happened more. In a grocery store, she saw light around a crying woman and comforted her, learning she'd lost her husband. On a bus, wool patterns danced in sunlight through the window, filling her with peace. She no longer doubted. Angels were here, and she'd grown attuned to them since the crash. But her mission was bigger than small moments. One night, she dreamed of Jesus again. He stood amid Ophanim, light softer now. The time has come, he said. You'll lead them to see. She woke, not afraid but resolute. She called Emily. I'm ready to publish. Emily cheered over the phone. I knew it. We're going big. Elizabeth smiled, feeling a new weight. A call from within she couldn't ignore. Elizabeth sat in Emily's cramped Chicago office, hands shaking as she held the proof of Wheels of Light. The cover was simple yet striking. A faint wheel of light on a deep blue field, her name in white below. Emily slid the publishing contract over, grinning. They're printing 5,000 copies first run. They think it's a hit, especially with your media buzz. Elizabeth signed, but her heart was heavy. This wasn't just a book. It was her promise to Jesus, to Ophanim, to herself. Release day was December 1, 2024, amid the Christmas rush. Local bookstores hosted signings, and Elizabeth reluctantly agreed. At her first, in a packed Barnes & Noble, dozens lined up, old and young, men and women curious to devout. An elderly man gripped her hand. "Lost my wife last year. Your story gives me hope." A purple-haired teen whispered. "I saw light when I nearly drowned. Thanks for speaking for me." Elizabeth smiled, emotions swirling, joy, fear, pressure. The book sold fast. In 2 weeks, 5,000 copies vanished, prompting 20,000 more. Talk shows called, from local slots to Good Morning America. She told her story, voice steady, eyes alight. Public opinion split. Some hailed her as inspirational, others as a spiritual con. She didn't care about fame. Each time she spoke, she felt Ophanim spinning nearby, approving. Success had a cost. Threats escalated, from harsh words to promises to end her. Jake added locks to her house. Emily hired a bodyguard for events. Elizabeth didn't fear death, she'd faced it, but failure. "Am I doing this right?" she asked in a dream. Jesus smiled. "You're on the path." December 15th, a week before Christmas, an email from Truth Guardians hit her inbox. Subject: Stop or Die. Inside, a video. Her image from a signing blacked out, a distorted voice. "We'll expose you as a fraud. Pull the book or face consequences." Emily called the FBI, but they said tracing was tough. Jake squeezed her hand. "They're bluffing, Liz. Don't let them win." They weren't. That night, driving home from an interview, a black SUV rammed her car off the road. Her windshield shattered as a masked figure smashed it with a metal rod. She screamed, floored the gas, and her car lurched free. Heart pounding, blood dripping from a glass cut. She called Jake. He rushed her to the police. Officer Daniels frowned. "This isn't a prank anymore. We'll up patrols." In her dream, the shadow loomed larger, growling to engulf her. Ophanim spun wildly, eyes blazing, driving it back. Jesus stood firm. "They fear the truth you carry. Don't stop." Waking, she knew she faced more than humans. A war of light and dark, with her at the center. Next day, at a St. Louis signing, black-clad protesters arrived, banners screaming, "Elizabeth Harper is a liar." They shouted through books and the crowd panicked. Her bodyguard pushed them back, but one man, eyes bloodshot, snarled, "You'll pay." She met his gaze, unshaken. "I've seen the truth," she said loud. "Have you?" The crowd hushed and they retreated. But she knew it wasn't over. Wheels of Light became a phenomenon. By late December, it sold over 100,000 copies, hitting New York Times bestseller lists. Churches booked her to speak, universities held seminars, and thousands of letters poured in. People finding hope, faith, or curiosity in a bigger world. She started small meetups, sharing more about Ophanim, cherubim, and angels in daily life. Pressure mounted. The FBI nabbed a Truth Guardian suspect, Michael Reed, a 35-year-old software engineer who admitted to the emails, claiming she was poisoning society with superstition. But he was a pawn. Elizabeth sensed a deeper, unseen force at play. In dreams, the shadow lurked, waiting. On December 24th, she spoke at a massive Atlanta church to thousands. Under bright lights, she recounted her journey, crash to light, Ophanim to Jesus. The crowd hushed, then roared applause. She ended. "We're not alone. Angels are around us, guiding us to something greater." Stepping down, an 8-year-old girl hugged her leg. "I saw an angel when my dad died. Thank you." Elizabeth knelt, tears falling. This was why she kept going. Then her phone rang. Jake panicked. "Liz, your house is on fire. I'm here with the cops." She raced back, heart sinking. Her apartment was ash, flames smoldering in the Christmas night. Her original notebook gone. She collapsed on the sidewalk, but Jesus' voice rang. You don't need paper. The truth's in you. After the fire, Elizabeth crashed with Jake, who wouldn't let her stay alone. Police ruled it arson but found no culprit. She lost her home, her things, but not her resolve. They think they can silence me, she told Jake, clutching a Wheels of Light copy. They're wrong. Jake nodded. You're tougher than they know, Liz. Support swelled. A charity raised funds to rebuild her home. Readers sent replacement books. Emily launched #Wheels of Light Lives online, and it went viral. Elizabeth appeared on The Ellen Show, her sincerity moving viewers to tears. Ellen gave her a $50,000 check to keep the mission going. She used it to start a small nonprofit, helping near-death survivors share their stories. Truth Guardians faded after Reed's arrest, but Elizabeth knew the darkness lingered. In dreams, Ophanim slowed, as if their work with her neared its end. Jesus appeared one last time in gentle light. You've done well, he said. Now they'll walk on their own. She asked, what more do I do? He smiled. Live and believe. On January 1, 2025, she spoke at a New York spiritual conference. Fearless, she shared her full journey. Crash, light, angels, and the dark fighting her. The truth doesn't need me to defend it, she said. It speaks through everyone who hears. The crowd stood cheering and she felt a warm glow inside. Ophanim, cherubim, all silently approving. Spring 2025. Elizabeth settled into a new small house outside St. Michael's. She didn't return to nursing full-time, focusing on her nonprofit. Wheels of Light sold over 500,000 copies, translated into 10 languages, and she got thousands of letters monthly. Stories of light, angels, hope from across the globe. She rarely saw Ophanim clearly now, but sometimes in sunlight or wind, she felt them, wheels ever turning, keeping the universe in order. Jake became her best friend, a constant presence. Sarah apologized, admitting she didn't understand but respected her faith. Elizabeth forgave and they mended ties. She stopped dreaming of Jesus, but his words echoed. Live and believe. She did, living simply, meaningfully, trusting what she'd seen. One March day, she walked the park where she'd met Emily. A breeze rustled the leaves and she saw it, wheel patterns in the branches, blue-white eyes flashing briefly. She smiled, knowing they were there, quietly working. She wasn't the story's center anymore. She'd passed it on, and the world carried it forward. On a wooden bench, Elizabeth gazed at the clear sky. She didn't know the future, but she didn't need to. The wheels of light still spun, angels still lingered, and she'd done her part. Thank you, she whispered, and a warm breeze answered, a greeting from the light.